The clink of glasses, soft chatter, and the gentle hum of a grand piano fill the air. A wealthy businessman leans back in his leather chair, swirling his drink with a smug expression. His eyes scan the room, then land on her, a black woman sitting at the grand piano, her fingers resting lightly on the keys. He smirks. "I hope you're not planning to play." His voice is loud enough for others to hear, amusement dripping from every word. A few nearby guests chuckle, casting skeptical glances at the woman. She doesn't react, not yet. The businessman leans forward, still grinning. "Pianos like this aren't for just anyone. Do you even know what you're doing?" He assumes she doesn't belong, that she could never match the brilliance of a true pianist. But what happens next? He never saw it coming. Before we dive in, comment where you're watching from. Have you ever seen someone underestimated only to prove everyone wrong? She wasn't just any pianist. And by the time she finished playing, the entire room, including the man who insulted her, would be left speechless. The businessman's smirk lingers as he watches her, expecting hesitation, uncertainty, anything but confidence. But the woman doesn't flinch. She meets his gaze for a brief moment, then calmly turns her focus back to the piano. She lifts the lid, her fingers hovering over the keys, poised, ready. She had spent her entire life at the piano. From the time her small fingers could barely reach an octave, she had played. In childhood, she practiced on a worn-out keyboard with missing keys. As a teenager, she snuck into music halls, listening to symphonies from the back rows, studying every note. By the time she reached adulthood, she could play pieces most trained musicians feared to attempt. But in places like this, places filled with the elite, the wealthy, the powerful, her talent was often ignored. Tonight would be no different, or so they thought. The hotel lobby shimmered under the glow of golden chandeliers. Crystal glasses clinked as well-dressed guests engaged in effortless conversation. Waiters in pressed uniforms moved swiftly, topping off drinks and delivering plates of delicately arranged food. At the center of it all sat a grand piano, black, sleek, polished to perfection, and untouched. It was there for ambiance, for show, a symbol of luxury rather than artistry. Few dared to play it, not unless they were approved. The businessman sat comfortably in one of the leather lounge chairs, watching the woman with amused curiosity. He was the kind of man who measured worth in status and wealth. In his world, talent was reserved for those who could afford it. To him, music was not a skill that came from passion or struggle. It was something taught in the world's best conservatories, perfected in mansions with private tutors. And she? She didn't fit that image. That's why, when she approached the piano, his smirk deepened. "You sure you want to do that?" he mused, swirling his drink. His voice carried effortlessly through the lobby, drawing the attention of nearby guests. She didn't respond. She simply adjusted the piano bench, focused. That only made him more entertained. "Pianos like this," he continued, tilting his head, "aren't for just anyone. You do know what you're doing, right?" A few quiet chuckles came from the surrounding tables. Some guests exchanged knowing glances, waiting to see what would happen. She could feel their eyes on her, their doubts pressing down like a heavy weight. But she had felt this before, many times. And every time, she had let her music do the talking. Tonight would be no different. She placed her hands on the keys, and then she began to play. The businessman leaned back in his plush leather chair, rolling his wrist as he swirled the golden liquid in his glass. His smirk had not faded. If anything, it had grown. His gaze lingered on the woman at the piano, amusement dancing in his eyes. He let out a soft chuckle, shaking his head. "You know," he said, his voice smooth but laced with condescension, Some people spend years learning this craft. He paused, just long enough for people nearby to turn their heads, drawn to his words. It's not just about pressing keys. A few guests exchanged side glances, sipping their drinks, waiting to see where this was going. The room had suddenly become more interested in their conversation than their own. The woman remained still, adjusting the bench with slow precision. She did not react. She had heard this before, too many times. The businessman tilted his head, studying her like she was a performer in a comedy act, unaware that she was the joke. "This piano," he said, waving a hand toward the grand, polished instrument, "isn't for just anyone." His voice was louder now, his words stretching across the room, catching the ears of more guests. Some subtly turned their chairs toward the scene unfolding, their conversations fading into silence. The woman ran her fingers gently across the keys, feeling their weight. The instrument was beautiful, powerful. She had played on pianos like this before, but every time she had, it had been a fight to get to them. Still, she did not speak. She simply lifted the piano lid, revealing the gleaming black and white keys beneath. The businessman arched an eyebrow, then let out a soft chuckle. "Oh," he said, his tone dripping with amusement. "So, you're actually serious?" He shook his head, leaning forward slightly. "You're really going to play?" She remained calm. But others... A soft laugh rippled through the crowd. Someone at the bar murmured something under their breath. A woman in a long velvet dress glanced at the businessman with a smirk, then took a slow sip of her wine. The air in the room had changed. This wasn't just an ordinary performance anymore. This was a test. And the businessman? He thought he had already won. She adjusted the height of the bench, testing the distance to the pedals. Her fingers hovered over the keys, not yet pressing, just feeling. But before she could start, the businessman let out a sharp laugh. "Wait, wait, wait," he interrupted, waving a hand as if stopping a child from making a mistake. He grinned, tilting his head. "I just want to make sure before this goes any further." He set his drink down on the table beside him. "Do you even know what a C major scale is?" This time, the laughter in the room was louder. A few guests chuckled openly. Others merely watched in silence, waiting to see how she would react. She exhaled slowly. Not because she was offended, but because she was tired. Tired of having to prove herself. Tired of people who assumed before they listened. Tired of the same predictable doubt. She had heard it all before. But tonight, she wouldn't speak. She would let the music answer for her. The businessman leaned back, watching her with pure amusement. "Well," he prompted, swirling his drink again. "Do you?" Finally, she looked up. Her gaze met his, steady, unwavering. And then she smiled. It was not a forced smile, not one of nervousness or frustration. It was a smile of knowing. She tilted her head slightly. "Would you like to find out?" she asked, her voice smooth, even. The businessman's smirk faltered, just for a second. There was something about the way she said it. So calm, so sure. A murmur passed through the guests closest to them. Even those who had laughed before now seemed more curious than amused. But the businessman? He wasn't backing down. He flashed a grin, nodding. "Oh, absolutely," he said, sitting up slightly. Then, with a casual flick of his wrist, he gestured toward the piano. "Go ahead," he said. "Play something. Let's see if you're as good as you think." The moment stretched. The energy in the room had shifted. She was no longer just a woman sitting at a piano. She was now the center of attention. Every eye in the room was on her. The bartender, halfway through pouring a drink, slowed his hand. A waiter, carrying a tray of champagne glasses, paused near a table. Some guests sat forward, watching, waiting. The businessman smirked, raising his glass as if already declaring victory. She placed her hands on the keys, and then she began to play. She placed her fingers on the keys, her posture still, her breath measured. The businessman's smirk remained, but there was a flicker of impatience in his eyes, as if he was waiting for her to make a mistake, waiting to be proven right. She exhaled slowly, and then she began to play. The first few notes were soft, delicate, precise, like raindrops tapping against a window. It was the kind of sound that made people lean in, straining to listen, expecting something simple. But then, she unleashed something entirely unexpected. Her fingers danced across the keys, effortlessly flowing through intricate melodies, each note cascading into the next with breathtaking speed and accuracy. The shift was immediate. The businessman's smirk faltered. A few guests at nearby tables glanced at one another, their conversations fading. A waiter, mid-step, stopped in his tracks, his tray of glasses trembling slightly as he turned toward the piano. Something was happening, something they hadn't expected. Her hands moved faster now, her fingers striking the keys with unwavering precision. Her body swayed slightly with the music, not dramatically, not in an exaggerated way, but in perfect harmony with the intensity of the piece. Her talent wasn't just in her technique. It was in her emotion. She wasn't just playing. She was speaking through the music, and suddenly, the entire room could hear her. The businessman's grip tightened around his drink. At first, his confidence remained. Surely, she was just playing something rehearsed, something anyone with a few lessons could pull off. But, as the music swelled, as the complexity of the composition unfolded before him, his smirk vanished completely. Because this wasn't simple. This wasn't something you learned in a few years at a prestigious music academy. This was something else entirely, something raw, natural, undeniable. One by one, guests stopped talking. The clinking of glasses, the murmuring of small conversations, all of it faded into nothingness. A hush fell over the room, so thick that it felt sacred. The waiters, normally unfazed by anything happening in the hotel, stood still. A couple near the bar abandoned their drinks entirely, their eyes locked onto the pianist, as if witnessing something once in a lifetime. Even the bartender, mid-pour, let the liquid in his shaker settle, his hands motionless. This was no longer a woman playing a piano in a hotel lobby. This was a performance, and every single person in the room could feel it. The businessman shifted in his seat. For the first time that night, he wasn't in control. He glanced around the room, as if searching for confirmation that this wasn't as impressive as it seemed. But no one was looking at him anymore. No one was laughing at his comments. No one even seemed to remember what he had said. All eyes were on her. His fingers tightened around his drink, knuckles whitening. He adjusted his tie, forcing a smirk back onto his face, but it didn't reach his eyes. Because for the first time in a long time, he was the one feeling small. The music built, climbing toward something powerful. Her fingers flew across the piano, each note weaving into the next with an elegance that felt effortless. Then, the peak, a breathtaking series of arpeggios rolling like waves, followed by a sharp, controlled pause, and finally, the last chord. Her hands pressed the final notes gently, but with absolute confidence. Then, stillness. No sound, no movement, just silence. Deafening, absolute silence, as if the entire room had forgotten how to breathe. The woman lifted her fingers from the keys, letting them hover for just a second before placing them in her lap. She sat still, waiting, but she didn't need to wait long, because in the next second, the room erupted. For a moment, there was nothing. No chatter, no movement. The weight of her final note still hung in the air, like an echo that refused to fade. The entire lobby, every guest, every server, every set of eyes that had once been filled with doubt, was frozen in stunned silence. And then, a single clap. Then another. And suddenly, the room erupted. Chairs scraped against the marble floor as guests stood to their feet. A wave of applause swept through the room, hands clapping in admiration, in awe, in the pure shock of what they had just witnessed. The same people who had once laughed at her were now cheering for her. The bartender wiped his hands on his towel, shaking his head with a grin. Well, damn! A waiter near the bar let out a low whistle. A woman near the front, who had been skeptical at first, turned to the person next to her and whispered, "I've never heard anything like that in my life." The businessman didn't move. His smirk was long gone. His fingers trembled slightly around his drink, the ice clinking softly against the glass as he swallowed hard. His mouth opened, but no words came out. That was... He blinked, shaking his head as if trying to process what had just happened. It wasn't supposed to go like this. She was supposed to embarrass herself. She was supposed to play a few notes and prove that he had been right all along. But instead, she had just played something so beyond anything he could comprehend, something so undeniably brilliant that even he, a man who never admitted defeat, was left speechless. Then, from the back of the room, another voice rose above the lingering applause. "I thought I recognized that technique." The crowd turned as a man in his 60s stepped forward, his presence commanding. His salt and pepper beard was neatly trimmed, and his tailored suit spoke of quiet sophistication. The businessman's eyes widened. He knew that voice. Professor Elliot Ramsey, a name that carried weight. One of the most renowned music professors in the country, a man whose critiques had shaped the careers of pianists worldwide. And now he was walking directly toward the woman at the piano. The professor stopped just beside the piano, his eyes filled with something rare, genuine admiration. "That," he said, his voice steady, "was one of the most impressive performances I've ever heard." A collective gasp rippled through the room. The businessman visibly stiffened. Professor Ramsey turned toward her, nodding thoughtfully. "The way you moved through those transitions, the precision, the way you controlled the intensity, flawless." The woman remained composed, though a small, knowing smile played at the corner of her lips. "Thank you," she said simply. Professor Ramsey folded his arms. "Where did you study?" The businessman perked up. Finally, something that would expose her. Surely, she had attended some prestigious academy, had trained under elite instructors. That had to be the reason she played like that. But then, she shrugged. "I didn't." Silence. The businessman's eyes widened again. "What?" "I never went to music school," she said. "Never had formal lessons. Everything I know, I learned on my own." The businessman visibly paled. He had spent years believing that talent had to be bought, that skill came from wealth, from privilege, from status. And yet, here she was, self-taught. And she had just played better than anyone he had ever heard. The woman turned to him now, finally meeting his gaze directly. Her voice was calm, powerful, absolute. "Still think I don't belong?" The businessman's jaw tightened. He had no comeback, no insult, no clever remark. For the first time in a very long time, he was speechless. And he hated it. The energy in the room had changed. She was no longer the outsider, the underestimated one, the woman at the piano who didn't belong. She was the one everyone respected now. And him? He was nothing more than the man who had doubted her. The crowd was no longer on his side. He felt it. He saw it. And it burned. He let out a forced chuckle, shaking his head. "Well," he muttered, reaching for his drink, "that was something." But it was weak. His words held no power anymore. No one was listening, because the moment he had mocked her, the moment he had assumed she was beneath him, he had already lost. She had never needed his approval, and now she had taken something from him that he would never get back. His authority, his credibility, his confidence. The woman simply nodded, as if she had expected this all along. She turned away, completely uninterested in his forced attempt to recover, because his opinion had never mattered. Not before, and certainly not now. She had let her music speak, and it had spoken louder than his arrogance ever could. As she stood from the piano, the applause rose again. Louder, stronger. This time, it wasn't just for her performance. It was for her victory. The businessman sat frozen in his chair, his world shrinking around him. His drink sat untouched, the ice melting, a quiet metaphor for the way his confidence had begun to dissolve. He had walked into this hotel feeling like a man of power, a man whose opinions dictated what was worthy and what wasn't. And yet, here he was, powerless. No one was looking at him anymore. They were still clapping for her, still murmuring, still stunned by the beauty of what they had just witnessed. For years, he had believed that talent was something exclusive, owned by the privileged, the trained, the ones who could afford it. But she had just shattered that belief in front of everyone. And the worst part? She had done it without ever needing his approval. He gripped his glass tighter, his fingers white against the cold surface, trying to ground himself, trying to think. But his mind was scattered. What was he supposed to say now? What could he say? His entire identity, the confident, wealthy man who could judge art and talent with absolute certainty, had just been publicly dismantled. He had mocked her, dismissed her, laughed at her, and now she had humbled him without even trying. No argument, no anger, just music, and the whole world had seen it. The pianist turned toward him, her gaze steady. The applause was still thundering behind her, but at that moment everything else faded. It was just her and him. He braced himself. Maybe she would say something sharp. Maybe she would humiliate him, rub it in, just like he had tried to humiliate her. But instead, she simply looked at him, and when she finally spoke, her voice was calm, even, absolute. Music isn't about wealth. The words hit him deeper than any insult ever could. She let the silence stretch for a moment, letting him absorb it. And then she added, "It's about passion." The businessman blinked. The weight of her words settled heavily on his chest. He had spent years believing that talent could be bought, that it only came from elite academies, from expensive tutors, from family names that held weight in high society. But she had just disproved all of that. In a matter of minutes, she had done something that money couldn't buy, and for the first time in a long time, he had nothing to say. He cleared his throat, forced a chuckle. "Well," he muttered, sitting up straighter, trying to reassemble the pieces of his shattered confidence. That was something. It was weak. Even he knew it. It held no weight, no authority. And no one was listening, because no one cared what he thought anymore. The crowd had already decided. She was the real talent. He was just the man who had doubted her. And that was his real loss. Not the embarrassment, not the stares, but the fact that from this night forward his words would never carry the same weight again. Not after this. Not after her. She didn't wait for his response, because she didn't need one. She had already won, not just because she proved him wrong, but because she had never needed to prove herself to him in the first place. She turned away, walking toward the other side of the lobby, past the murmuring guests, past the ones who had once laughed with him, but now stood in silent admiration for her. She walked tall, with dignity, with grace, because she had always belonged here. He just hadn't seen it. The businessman exhaled, pressing his lips together, gripping his drink like it was the last piece of control he had left. He wanted to say something, anything, a final remark, a last attempt at holding on to the power he had lost. But as he looked around, he realized something painful. No one cared what he had to say anymore. Not tonight, maybe not ever again. She had taken something from him that he would never get back. His credibility, and in a place like this, that meant everything. She didn't look back. But he did. He watched her disappear into the crowd, knowing that from this moment forward nothing would ever be the same. He had walked into this night believing that he was the judge of what was good. But tonight, he had been the one judged, and he had been found small. The moment would pass. The guests would eventually return to their drinks, to their quiet conversations. But this night would never be forgotten, not by the people who had witnessed it, not by the woman who had played, and certainly not by him. The businessman sat still, staring at the grand piano as if seeing it for the first time. The echoes of her performance still lingered in the air, even though she had already walked away. She never looked back, because she didn't need to. She had proved something far greater than talent. She had shown that greatness isn't measured by wealth or privilege. It isn't defined by expensive lessons, prestigious schools, or family names. Talent isn't measured by status or wealth. It's about passion, dedication, and believing in yourself. She believed. And because of that, she left a room full of people speechless. Have you ever been underestimated? How did you prove them wrong? Share your story in the comments. We want to hear how you turned the tables and showed the world your worth. If this story inspired you, hit like and subscribe for more powerful stories that deserve to be heard. Because everyone has a moment where they prove their worth. And when your moment comes, make sure the world is watching. Until next time, keep believing in yourself, keep pushing forward, and never let anyone tell you that you don't belong.